Great. Well, welcome everyone to Mental Health, Your Rights to Privacy and Adjustments. I'm Tab Ahmed. I'm the CEO of Employability. Thank you very much for joining. And before I begin, I want to just say that this is a safe space for learning. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask. I know we're recording this session, but you can ask questions during the session. And if you're not, if you don't want to ask verbally, you can put questions in the chat. Okay, so moving on, I want to tell you a bit more about employability in case you're not familiar with who we are. So who we are and how we can help. So our mission is to create a truly inclusive workplace for neurodiverse and disabled people. And we are unapologetic in our drive for equality and a level playing field. So we support students with neurodiversity, mental health conditions, other conditions, any disability, to transition from education to employment so that you can build the careers that you deserve. And we work with organizations, with companies, with other organizations to guide them towards becoming more inclusive, specifically more disability inclusive. I set the business up back in 2006, and since then we have supported over 13,000 students and graduates with disabilities into employment. So through us, the first thing you need to do is register with us, and once you've registered, you have access to a whole host of different things you can use us for. You can apply through us to various internships and graduate programs, scholarship days, insight days. You can attend any of our student empowerment sessions, and we run lots of those. And if you go onto our website, you'll see there's some that we ran last summer, covering things like partly a bit like the session today, but other things as well. And we also run various other coaching sessions as well, empowerment sessions for students. So please have a look, keep a regular lookout on our website and see what's coming up. And please feel free to join those free webinars and sessions. And we offer you one-to-one adjustments advice. So if you're applying to a particular employer and you want advice around how to have the highest chance of success, whether that's about what does your CV look like, which I know your career service are very good at and help you with as well, but we can be an added resource there. But also specifically if there's any questions around disability, if you've been impacted in your education, maybe because you had late diagnosis, you didn't have the right support in place and therefore didn't get the grades you're expecting, or if you took longer to complete your degree, or if you feel you haven't had access to the same work experience opportunities as colleagues without contemporaries without a disability have had, then you can certainly talk to us about any of that, and we'll offer you one-to-one adjustments advice for the recruitment process, and also once you get employment for that as well. And we can talk to you about what your rights are, how best to ask those adjustments, or even if you want us to, then we can advocate on your behalf and speak to employers that you're applying to once we've discussed your adjustments with you. As I said, do use us, and you can also become an Employability Campus Ambassador, and that's about finding out more about who we are and what we do, and then being able to talk to your fellow students about it to make sure they also know about this free support that's on offer to students with disabilities. So please do reach out to us if you're interested in that. And my colleague Cindy McAllister is responsible for that. But if you register with us, and you can write to the info account and find out how you can actually become an Employability Campus Ambassador as well. So since today's session really is about mental health, I wanted to have a look at what is mental health as a disability, what is a mental health disability? And this covers a very wide range of conditions. 17% of university students have a mental health condition. But in law, or under the Equality Act, which is the act that covers protection for anybody with any sort of disability or mental health condition or neurodiversity, the focus is on the impact it has on you and not on the diagnosis. So even if you don't have a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis, we can still support you and we can still work with you, and you can still get the adjustments you need, irrespective of a formal diagnosis, when you're applying to employers. If your condition, your mental health condition, has more than a small effect on your everyday life, then that is impacting you, and therefore you might need some support and some adjustments for that. And typically in law, in the Equality Act, any kind of disability or mental health condition, etc., needs to have lasted for, or at least is expected to last for, at least 12 months or more. So as an example, if you undergo a bereavement of somebody you're close to, understandably, you'll be very upset. It might take you many months to recover from that. But if you do then make a full recovery before 12 months and you don't have any ongoing symptoms from that, then that would not be deemed to be a disability under the Equality Act. But if you have cyclical depression, or if you have panic attacks that don't happen all the time but happen on a regular basis, then if you have seasonal affective disorder, those sorts of things that keep coming back, even though they might not be present all the time, then that is a disability, and that's a mental health disability, and therefore you have legal protection under the Equality Act when you're making applications to employers. But as we said before, this isn't about formal diagnosis. This is about making sure you get the support that you need. And when we talk to employers, we talk about best practice beyond compliance. And what that means is that we want employers to make sure they put the right support in place if you need that, so that you can do as well as you can going through the recruitment process. So don't worry about the definition, and ask for the adjustments if you think you need them. And if you're unsure, talk to us and we can help you work that out and understand what sorts of adjustments might be best suited for you. I know that mental health can be really, really hard to talk about. I'll just share a small story with you. I work in this space, and I've been working in this space from before I set up employability even, so probably for about the last 18 years or so. And it only occurred to me probably about 6-7 years ago that actually I have a disability. I have a mental health disability. I've had very bad panic attacks, and I've had those for years and years and years since I was quite young. But even though I work in this space, it had never occurred to me that I actually have a disability. And suddenly when the penny did drop, I thought, gosh, wow, I've been working in this space. I advise people about this, and yet it hadn't occurred to me that I myself have a disability, have a mental health disability. And that was quite interesting. And I think one of the reasons for that was that often when we have something for a very long time, whether it's a neurodiversity, whether it's a mental health condition, whether it's any other disability, we're so used to the adjustments we make for ourselves. We're so used to our coping strategies. We're so used to doing things in a particular way that actually we sort of stop remembering that actually things might still be quite difficult, but we've just learnt some really good coping strategies. And so we almost don't think of it as a disability. But that doesn't mean the impact of it isn't still quite significant and isn't profound on you and your life. So I think one of the reasons that a lot of people find it hard to talk about mental health is, first of all, there's a lot of stigma around it. People make judgment, people have assumptions about what it means if you have a mental health condition, and that stigma can make it quite hard to talk about to other people, or to feel that you will be supported in the right way, perhaps. So you might have fears about that, and you might not want to have some sort of label attached to you. And I think that's often another reason why people don't want to name what it is that's going on for them, worrying about other people's perceptions of what's happening for you or what your condition might mean or not mean. And then this thing called imposter syndrome, which I've just talked about with reference to my own situation, where I sort of feel, well, but disability is about something that's physical, something that's visible. It's about somebody in a wheelchair, or somebody with a missing limb, or something much more profound, like somebody maybe who's blind or deaf or that sort of thing. And we often minimize the impact of mental health because it's not visible, because you sort of think, well, it's not really a disability, is it? It's just something that I have to deal with. So there's a lot of that around imposter syndrome, and not feeling as if it's important enough or significant enough for you to worry other people about, for you to become a pain, for you to become a nuisance and ask for the support that you need. But as I said, the impact can be profound. And if you do have a mental health condition, it's really important that you, in some ways, don't discriminate against yourself by not asking for the support that you need. So it's really important that you do reach out, you do seek the support you need, and particularly in employment, going through looking for roles, when you're making applications, going through recruitment process, if you're at an interview, it's really, really important that you seek the support that you need so that you have the best possible chance of success. So that brings us on to adjustments in recruitment. What sorts of things can you receive, and this isn't a comprehensive list, this is an exhaustive list. It means that there may very well be other things that you might need that aren't listed here, but I've just mentioned a couple of things here that lots of candidates we work with do need, but you might have other needs, so do speak to us about those individualized needs and we will help you with those. But some things that can be helpful is things like rest breaks. So if you're attending multiple interviews or very long interviews, for example, or an assessment day with an employer, it might be really helpful for you to have rest breaks either in between the interviews or during a long interview, so that you don't feel overwhelmed by that situation. You can still perform as well as you can by having rest breaks in between. Of course, these days we're all doing things remotely. Most things, most interviews, most assessment days and so on happen remotely. And sometimes we know that for many people that can feel quite exposing. It can feel very, very stressful to have your camera on. It's a very different way of engaging with people through like this remotely via Zoom or any other platforms that you might be asked to engage on. And so another adjustment can be to ask to have your camera switched off, so that might, if that's going to help to reduce the risk, if that's going to help you reduce your anxiety, and if that's going to make it easier for you to do well in the interview, for example. Body language. So sometimes people with mental health conditions or different mental health conditions, whether it's depression or anxiety or whatever that looks like for you, sometimes people can find it very, very difficult to sound enthusiastic, particularly if you're going through a difficult time. So to sound enthusiastic or sound very engaged or to sound upbeat, those sorts of things. So some adjustments that we ask employers to make are physical things like having your camera switched off, for example, but other adjustments, or rest breaks, but other adjustments are things like what we call attitudinal adjustments. So it's asking an employer to not judge you negatively for something like not sounding enthusiastic, if that's the impact of your disability or of your health condition, of your mental health condition. So again, there are subtle things we can ask employers to do to make sure that the impact of your condition doesn't go against you when you're being assessed by an employer. And then, of course, there's things like extra time. So some people can find it very helpful, for example, to have extra time if they're being assessed in a particular way, either in a test as part of a recruitment process, or maybe even for the interview, for example. You might want to have a slightly longer time when you're allowed to have thinking time to process your thoughts before you answer, for example. So again, those sorts of things, extra time, can also be accommodated in interviews. And then alternative format. If you don't feel comfortable to be interviewed, for example, through a remote platform like this, or if you prefer a phone interview, or if you prefer face-to-face, may be becoming possible again soon, but there may be different ways in which an employer can interview you, which might not be the way they typically do it as part of their process, if that's an adjustment that you need to have. And then rescheduling. So if you find that as you're approaching an interview, you're getting more and more nervous, you're feeling extra anxious, beyond what you might normally feel, and it's normal for everybody to feel a little bit anxious between an interview, but if you feel it's overwhelming you and you're not going to be able to perform because of that, then hopefully if the employer can accommodate it, it's reasonable to ask that interview to be rescheduled and to do it at another time when maybe you will be feeling a little bit less anxious as well. Are there any questions?
Yes, I think there is a question, but it's probably a question for later on. So we'll deal with that when it comes along. It looks like it's an advice on disclosure.
Okay, well, we might cover that.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. So, and again, I've just talked about recruitment process adjustments, but workplace adjustments might be quite similar to those in recruitment. So things like rest breaks, camera off, extra time, those sorts of things. But there might be some additional adjustments that you need in the workplace if you won't actually get offered a role and you're going to start the company. If that's going to happen, then we'll have a different, separate conversation with you about what your workplace adjustments might look like. So we want you to think of adjustments in different ways, so for different parts of the process. So one is for the recruitment process, all the different elements of that, which might be a test or an interview or assessment day, whatever that looks like. As a separate thing is workplace adjustments. And so once you get made an offer, that is the time They will speak to you about workplace adjustments before you start, and in plenty of time for the employer to put those adjustments in place, and then we can advocate that on your behalf if you would like us to the employer. Something really important here is that employers can only ask you about adjustments for the recruitment process during the recruitment process. They can't ask you about workplace adjustments you might need in the recruitment process. You don't need to share what workplace adjustments you need with an employer whilst they're still assessing you for whether or not they want to hire you. Once they make you the offer, that's the appropriate time to have a discussion around workplace adjustments. So one of these might be understanding from colleagues. You might, for example, need to come in later or leave earlier or have rest breaks during the day, or to have interaction in particular with colleagues that might be more helpful to you. And if that's the case, then those are, again, adjustments that you can expect to get from colleagues as attitudinal adjustments from your colleagues to enable you to feel comfortable in the workplace. A mental health condition shouldn't prevent you from being promoted. It's a protected characteristic, as we've said, under the Equality Act, so you're protected in law to make sure you get the right adjustments and that doesn't go against you in terms of things like promotion or access to benefits and those sorts of things. And no disciplinary action for behaviours resulting from mental health condition can take place either. So if, for example, you've asked for time off because you need to go and see a therapist or a healthcare professional, or you need time off because of your mental health condition, then that can't be used by an employer as a disciplinary action. So we have to sort of separate out what the disciplinary actions look like versus the impact of your disability and what you might need to do to manage that. And things like adapting or changing a role once you're in a workplace might also be a reasonable thing for the employer to be able to do in order to accommodate how you're impacted by your mental health condition. But again, adjustments at work in the workplace are things we can speak to you about in much more detail once you get offer of employment. Of course, we all know that mental health conditions can be aggravated in stressful situations, and interviews and assessments, those sorts of things, are stressful situations. And it can be even more stressful if you then have to think about, well, what adjustments will I need? How do I ask for them? What do I have to share with an employer in order to get them? All of those sorts of questions. Because of our partnership, we are happy to have that conversation with you. We can advise you on what might be available to you, and these might be different adjustments from those that you've received in education. So there might be additional adjustments you might need, or just look different. It might be more than the amount of time you've received at college, for example. So do talk to us about those. And if you would then like us to advocate on your behalf, i.e. to speak to the employer about what these adjustments are, then we can do that on your behalf, taking away at least that anxiety out of it for you, so you can just show up knowing that the employer is going to put the right adjustments in place for you to do as well as you can. So I've got next I'm going to talk about some misconceptions around disclosure and disability. Before I go into that, I know there was a question earlier Kirsty mentioned around disclosure. I don't know exactly what that question was, but one thing I wanted to point out to you, and I think I've already said it, but I'm just going to say it again, is during the recruitment process, you do not need to, you're not required to by law. There's no moral reason, there's no judgment reason, there's none of those things that mean that you have to tell an employer that you have a disability or what that disability is. And an employer by law is not allowed to ask you those questions either under Section 60 of the Equality Act. So an employer in the recruitment process can't ask you anything, any details about your disability. By extension, that also means employers shouldn't be asking you for things like medical evidence to prove that you have a disability, or any evidence such as educational psychologist reports to assess what sort of adjustments you need. The only thing that an employer should lawfully be asking you for during the recruitment process is whether or not you need adjustments. So you can ask for adjustments without telling the employer any details of your disability or even the name of your disability. So the first misconception: to get adjustments, I have to talk about my mental health condition. Well, as I've just said, you don't actually. You just have to tell them what adjustments you need. And it's really important that you distinguish between disclosing you have a disability. So if you ask for adjustments, the assumption is you have some form of disability or mental health condition. but you don't have to state what that disability is. Instead, you just tell them about what adjustments you need in a way that's going to enable them to make those adjustments. And for that, you talk to us and we can support you with that. They can't and shouldn't be asking you anything else about your disability. Kirsty, was there a question?
It was a question about when to disclose, and then actually probably slightly more relevant, because you've kind of covered that now, is what about schemes that guarantee you an interview if you declare?
Yes, so I'm going to talk about that shortly. Yeah. So first of all, on the when, there is a lot of mixed stuff out there about, and I think there's a lot of misinformation about this. And this whole idea of disclosure, and even that word disclosure, is a bit of a hangover from the old Disability Discrimination Act before Equality Act 2010. Because before that, employers could ask you if you have a disability, and they could ask you what that disability is. But since Equality Act 2010, under Section 60 of that Act, employers are prohibited from asking you any questions about your disability during the recruitment process. Once you have offer of employment, once they make you an offer, at that point they are allowed to ask you further questions about disability, because at that point the duty on them to make adjustments is far greater. So for your purposes, during the recruitment process, employers should not be asking you about anything about disability. So that's the first bit, that's the legal bit, if you like. Now, on the other side, there is a lot of personal preference that people have, and there's been a lot of, I would say, very emotive language that's being used in this space by people who might believe that it's the right thing to tell an employer, to be as honest as possible, to not be misleading, those sorts of sort of terms. And honesty is a very emotive term. I would say to you, it's not about honesty. It's not about not misleading. It's not about any of those things. And the law actually doesn't consider it to be about any of those things. It's instead about what we call your privacy and your choice. If you want to talk to an employer about your disability or want to tell them about it, that's fine, that's up to you. But there isn't a legal requirement to do so. And in fact, to get adjustments, you do not need to do so. So I think, I would really strip away any of the sort of, I'd say, more emotionally laden words around this, like honesty and you should tell an employer or tell them as early as possible, etc., etc. Because actually telling an employer what your disability is doesn't really give them any information about the adjustments that you need. There's no reason why an employer is going to know if you tell them you have dyslexia, for example, or if you tell them you have depression, for example. There's no reason, excuse me, just have a sip of water here. There's no reason why that employer is going to know what adjustments you need just because you've told them what disability you have. Because people with the same disability often need different adjustments. And so the approach we take at Employability is it's really important that the adjustments are individualized to you and what your specific needs are. And that's not about what disability you have. Instead, it's just about what adjustment needs do you have. So I'd rather that you think about this in terms of what adjustments do I need, rather than what disability do I have. Much more relevant and much more useful for you to share with the employer what adjustments you need, rather than what disability you have. But it's your privacy and it's your choice. And if you wish to share that information with the employer, that is also your choice. But there isn't any moral imperative to do that. There's no legal reason to do that. And you certainly shouldn't be being made to feel guilty and then doing that if you're not comfortable to do so. So I hope that answers that question around I should tell an employer early on, etc., etc. I would say tell an employer at the point at which you need the adjustment. So for example, if you're applying to an employer and your profile, you're aware your profile might look different from those that they typically see of other people making that application. For example, maybe you took longer to complete a degree because of the impact of your disability. Or maybe you didn't get the grades you were expecting because you didn't have the right support in place because you were undiagnosed, or you didn't get access to the sort of work experience you know that your kind of fellow students would have got. Those sorts of things that make your profile look different. If that's the case, then I would say in the application, if there's an opportunity, if there's a space for you to let them know why your profile looks different. You don't have to go into the details of your disability. You can just say, yeah, I had, because of my disability and the impact of that, it took me longer to complete my degree, or I didn't have the right support in place, but now that I have, you can see my grades have shot up, for example. However you want to explain that, you can explain that. If there's a gap, you can explain that as well. But you don't have to put down details of your disability to explain it. You can just say, because of the impact of my condition, I had to take some time out, but now I've recovered, I'm back on track, for example. The reason to state it there is that so you can explain the difference in profile, because what you're asking the employer to do is to make what we call an attitudinal adjustment, and not to adjust their own attitude to how they'll screen your application, so that does not go against you. But if you don't need any adjustments at that point, in other words, there's nothing the employer needs to do while they're reviewing your application that you're impacted by that's different than anybody else in terms of how your application looks, then there isn't a need to tell the employer anything. But if you get to the next stage, which might be a test, for example, and maybe you need extra time for that, then as soon as you're invited to that test, make sure you have the relevant discussion with us, or if you know what your adjustments are, tell the employer what adjustments you need so that those can be put in place for you to have the chance to do as well as possible in that test, and similarly for interviews. So as long as you tell the employer in plenty of time for them to make the adjustment for that next stage of the recruitment process, and they can therefore make that adjustment to allow you to perform well, then that's all you need to be able to do. Any other questions around that particular topic before I go on to the next one?
No, I think you probably have covered it, Tab. Obviously, there will be a sort of a when and how as we go. But that has covered what we've talked about.
Great, thank you. And I will come back to the disability confidence schemes and specific schemes and so on. I think we cover that a bit later. So disclosure misconception 2, I need to disclose my mental health condition so that the employer will know what I need. Well, we've sort of spoken about this already, right? There is no reason to suppose this. There's no reason to suppose the employer is going to need what adjustments you need just because you tell them your disability. You tell them what you need, and we can help you with this, and we can provide the advocacy around it. Misconception 3. I need to provide medical records to prove that I have a condition. Employers, again reiterating here, are not entitled to ask for proof of disability or any disability information in order to provide the adjustments. They can't therefore ask for educational psychologist reports or medical records during the recruitment process. Now it says here they can't. They do sometimes, but they shouldn't is the right word here. It's unlawful for them to do that. So if you're not comfortable providing those things, we would recommend you don't provide those things. You can write them a very polite message back saying, under the Equality Act Section 60 and due to my privacy under GDPR rules, I will not be providing this information, but here's the adjustments that I need. Because there's a nice polite way of responding to them if they ask you for information that they shouldn't be asking you for. They can ask you about your disability once they've made you a job offer though, and then it's up to you what you wish to tell them. Misconception 4. How do I know if the adjustment I'm asking for is reasonable? So you've probably heard this term quite a lot. There's a term in the Equality Act called reasonable adjustments. Now that term reasonable has a very specific meaning in law, and it has to be based on the facts and circumstances, but it's started to be used in common speak. And I think it's really important that you sort of understand what that term means and how it will apply to you. We encourage more and more employers to just stop using that term reasonable and just use the word adjustments. What adjustments do you need? Because in common speak, what's reasonable for me might be different from what's reasonable for you or from the next person. So the first thing I'd say is assume that the adjustment that you need will be reasonable. Okay, assume that just to begin with, particularly if you're applying for things that aren't very physical or hard labor and those sorts of things. So, if you're applying for desk-based roles, if you're applying to work in an office, those sorts of things, assume that the adjustment will be relevant. Now, I mentioned facts and circumstances, and that's to do with it can depend on the size of the organisation you're applying to. It can depend on the financial resources of the organisation you're applying to. It can depend upon the intrinsic function of the role you're applying to. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you want to be an Uber driver, but you're completely blind, then an intrinsic function of the role is being able to drive that car safely, in which case you can't actually do the job at all. So intrinsic function almost always applies to some physical aspect of the role that is necessary to do that very job. So in most other roles, it wouldn't apply. So don't worry about that too much. I'd say the easiest thing is make the assumption that the adjustment you need is reasonable. And if you're unsure, talk to us and we can talk to you about it. If for any reason the adjustment isn't reasonable, however, it's for the employer to refuse it, and they will need to have a very good reason to refuse it. And they'll have to prove why they refused it. So the onus is really on the employer to refuse it if they don't think it's reasonable. The onus isn't on you to come up with reasonable adjustments. You just have to come up with the adjustments you need to allow you to do as well as you can going through the process. Ask for what you need, you'll generally get it, and remember the law is on your side. Misconception number 5. It's better not to ask for adjustments to avoid discrimination. And I'd say to that you must ask for the adjustments that you need, because you have a much better chance of success with the right adjustments in place. It's illegal to discriminate, and most reputable companies, most reputable employers will not risk it. So whatever you've heard out there, it's definitely better to ask for the adjustments that you need. And remember, you can do it without having to talk about your disability. And most reputable companies will not risk discriminating against you because of disability or because you've asked for the adjustments that you need. If they do, then first of all, they can be legally challenged. But secondly, you might then want to think about, do I really want to work for an employer who is discriminatory? So I'd make the assumption that employers aren't going to discriminate, because most of them won't. And I would ask for the adjustments that you need. Because if you don't ask for the adjustments that you need, the chances are you're not going to get through the process. And in that situation, in fact, you're sort of discriminating against yourself, because you haven't asked for what you need. You reduced your chances of getting through, and the chances are you're probably not going to get through anyway. So I think it's much safer just to ask what you need, and then let's see what happens. So the golden words for us, and I've mentioned these already, are privacy and choice when it comes to your disability and any sort of details of your disability. It's your condition, therefore it's your choice what you choose to tell anybody about it. Now, this applies particularly in the case of what we call non-visible disabilities, so mental health conditions, neurodiversities, any long-term health conditions. Of course, in situations where your disability is visible, for example, if you're in a wheelchair, you have a physical visible disability, then in some ways that privacy and choice is taken away from you, particularly if somebody visibly sees you. But particularly in the case of something like mental health, where there's a lot of stigma around it and so on, it's your condition, it's your choice what you choose to tell people about it or not tell them. You define what you consider private. The law's on your side, and you certainly don't need to disclose anything in order to get the adjustments that you need. So next, I want to talk about why you might want to tell an employer about your mental health. We've said you don't need to, but you might want to. And I know one of the questions that came up in the chat was around this. So, and I'm going to cover that shortly. So one reason why you might want to, some of you might have seen application forms. There's various competency questions, things like tell us about a time when you performed well as part of a team, or tell us about a time when you were in a difficult situation, how did you deal with that? Those sorts of questions are competency-based questions. Now, if you want to use what you've learned as a result of your disability, which might be about resilience, it might be about tenacity, whatever those sorts of things look like for you, if you want to use those in order to demonstrate the competency you're being asked about, and you feel that the best example you can use for that is actually from the strategy you've been working with your own disability, then that's okay. You can use that as an example. I'd only use it once. I wouldn't use it for every competency, but that's okay. And then, you still don't have to go into huge amounts of details if you don't want to, but you can talk about the difficulties that's presented to you and how you resolve those, for example. So it's okay to use it as part of answering a competency question if you feel comfortable to do that, if you'd like to do that. You might want to tell an employer about your disability because maybe you want to assess their attitude. Any sort of recruitment process is as much about you assessing the employer as about them assessing you. And you may not want to work with an employer who's discriminatory. You may not want to work for an employer who isn't inclusive. So you may want to tell them in order to see what their response is, how they react to that. Do they react in the right way? Are they an employer you actually would feel comfortable to work for example? It might be you want to tell an employer because they're running a very specific scheme, for example, or you need a particular qualification for the job. So if you're applying to a disability charity, it might be relevant for you to tell them that you have a disability. Again, you don't have to go into any more detail than that, because it's relevant for the actual role. Maybe they want people with disabilities to apply for that specific role, that particular organisation, because they want somebody who's got lived experience of disability, for example. Or some companies you might have seen might have what are called disability confident badges or disability confident schemes, those sorts of things. And that means that if you tell them that you have a disability, you might be able to skip certain parts of the recruitment process. Or I know that I would sometimes work with employers who might say that they have a specific program for people with autism, for example, people with neurodiversities, or any of those sorts of programs. So it might be that your disability means you qualify for those specific programs, which might entitle you to get that role. And for that, you will have to state what the condition is in order to actually get onto that scheme or that particular program. So if it's to your benefit in order to get onto a program, or to perhaps not take part in certain parts of the recruitment process because your disability enables you to skip those parts of the process, or it's a particular qualification for a particular role, if it's to your benefit to talk about your disability, then I would certainly do that. So here we're looking at relevance. An example I often like to use is that I've got 2 kids, for example, and they're really important to me, and they're a really important part of my life. But if I go to an interview, I wouldn't necessarily talk about the fact that I've got 2 kids because it's not relevant. Now, if I was at an interview at which it was relevant, or it became relevant to talk about it, or to use something to do with them as an example, then I might talk about it. So it's about relevance. And so you might want to tell an employer about your mental health condition if it's relevant to do so, i.e. it's a particular qualification for the role, you've learned a particular skill set you want to talk about, or because it means that you can benefit from a particular scheme or apply to certain schemes because you have that particular disability. And lastly, I'd say you might want to tell an employer about your mental health condition because it's important to you. Maybe for you personally, it's something that you want to share, in which case that's okay. And the only caveat I'd have to that is I'd say, obviously, again, it's about relevance. Is a recruitment process, an interview is about, it's about highlighting your skill set, your competencies, what you can do if you were to get that role, what sort of skills you have for that particular role. So it's fine if you want to talk about your disability and it's important to you, maybe you using it as a competency, for example, what you've learned from that. But otherwise, I'd just stick to the relevance of it. So it may be important to you, but I'd obviously just assess how much of that you might want to talk about, just keep it to relevant to the particular situation that you're in. So I hope that answers the earlier question as well around qualification or scheme. And are there any other questions that have come up in the meantime, Kirsty?
No, there is nothing, and I think that has answered the question about discrimination.
Thank you. So moving on next, we said an employer can ask you about your disability once an offer has been made. You don't have to tell them if you still don't want to, but it might be relevant for you to tell them in order to get the adjustments that you need. An employer cannot lawfully withdraw an offer because of your condition, because that would be discriminatory. And again, as we said, most reputable employers will not discriminate. So again, don't worry about that. If that does happen, it's again a discussion you can have with us down the road. And of course, you may then want to think about, would you want to work for a discriminatory employer? So you can access our services by registering on our website. Applications for internships and graduate programs are on our website, and once you register them, all services are available to you completely free. And if you have any questions or need things in alternative formats, you can also speak to us about those as well.